when friendship turns into betrayal, the silent breakup. Friendship is often advertised as the one investment in life that never loses value. Bonds are branded as unbreakable, loyalty as eternal, and promises as sacred. But anyone who has actually tried the experiment knows better. Friendships crack far more easily than porcelain teacups, and when they shatter, the piece is cut just as deep. If love stories end in heartbreak, then friendship stories end in ridicule, and ridicule is a far crueler fate than mere pain. Because pain fades, but the embarrassment of trusting the wrong person lingers like a bad perfume on a borrowed jacket. This is the story of two friends, though calling them that will soon feel like a stretch. For now, let's pretend the word still holds. Imagine a pair so intertwined that strangers mistook them for siblings, though no blood tied them together. Imagine years of shared secrets, casual mockery of everyone else, and the smug conviction that their alliance was indestructible. Yes, imagine that smugness, because smugness always sets the stage for disaster. Our tale begins not in some glamorous city or exotic escape, but in the monotony of suburban familiarity. Rows of houses identical as photocopies, streets too quiet to feel alive, and neighbors who treated gossip as a currency. It was the sort of place where people waved while secretly counting the weeds in your lawn. In such a habitat, friendship wasn't just a comfort, it was survival. And these two had survived by clinging to each other, by creating their own tiny kingdom where mockery of others disguised itself as wit, and private jokes pretended to be profound truths. The mood, oh, the mood, was one of superiority, though neither of them had achieved much worth bragging about. That's the beauty of youth. You can be arrogant for free, with no accomplishments to back it up. They saw themselves as cleverer than classmates, cooler than coworkers, and far more trustworthy than anyone else in their orbit. Trustworthy, of course, being the word destined to boomerang with cruel irony. Betrayal rarely enters the scene with trumpets or fireworks. It slips in quietly, like a cat through a half-open door, unnoticed until it begins clawing at the curtains. And here, too, the signs were subtle at first. A glance that lingered too long. A compliment offered too sweetly. A secret repeated when it should have been guarded. But before any of that, there was only the illusion of safety. The smug, unshakable certainty that nothing could possibly touch them. And isn't that always the most delicious setup for disaster? So, here lies the stage. Two friends basking in their own self-created legend, surrounded by mediocrity they believed themselves immune to. They laughed too loudly, trusted too blindly, and assumed that loyalty was as natural as breathing. And, like all humans who believe themselves untouchable, they had already stepped onto the grease slope leading to humiliation. The truth is, friendships don't usually end with explosions. They dissolve in whispers, in omissions, in sarcastic remarks disguised as jokes. They rot from within, until one day you look at the person who once held your entire history, and all you can see is a stranger. That moment, when the familiar face feels foreign, is far sharper than heartbreak, because it doesn't just strip you of someone. It strips you of the version of yourself who believed in them. And that is exactly the journey we are about to witness. The slow unraveling of what once seemed eternal, the sarcastic theater of promises turned punchlines. For now, we begin where all disasters begin, at the peak of confidence, where falling feels unthinkable. Their names were Clara and Evelyn, two halves of a smug little empire built on sarcasm and secrets. Clara, with her restless energy and constant hunger for attention, wore her insecurities like jewelry, flaunted and polished daily, though she pretended otherwise. Evelyn, quieter but sharper, carried herself with the air of someone perpetually unimpressed. Where Clara sought the spotlight, Evelyn controlled the commentary from the shadows. Together, they made an odd but effective duo. Clara set the fire, Evelyn supplied the oxygen. They met in school, the kind of friendship that began not with affection but with mutual disdain for everyone else. In a classroom full of bland personalities, they discovered each other as if by accident, though in truth they were drawn by that magnetic sense of shared superiority. Everyone else was too dull, too ordinary, too desperate to fit in. But Clara and Evelyn? They had a higher purpose, mocking the dullness around them. A sport, really. Some bonded over sports teams or favorite books. These two bonded over their ability to ridicule their peers with razor-sharp precision. Years blurred together. College, jobs, disappointments that felt enormous at the time, but, in retrospect, barely registered. Through it all, Clara and Evelyn sustained themselves on their alliance. They shared everything: failed romances, humiliating work stories, embarrassing family squabbles. They didn't just confide, they weaponized their confessions into further proof of their loyalty. Who else could you show your ugliest side to and still feel adored afterward? Clara, ever theatrical, loved to call Evelyn her anchor. She did it in front of others, basking in the image of their closeness. Evelyn didn't return the compliment because Evelyn didn't do compliments. She let Clara's dramatics hang in the air, answering with a raised eyebrow or a smirk, which Clara interpreted as affection. And maybe it was, though, the kind of affection that feeds itself on control more than on warmth. Their lives, though outwardly different, had an irritating tendency to run parallel. Clara, who fancied herself ambitious, bounced from one half-baked career plan to another, announcing each with excessive enthusiasm before abandoning it weeks later. Evelyn, far more disciplined, slid into a stable but uninspiring job in an office, where the fluorescent lights sucked the spirit out of everyone. Clara mocked Evelyn for being boring. Evelyn mocked Clara for being delusional. They called it honesty, but really it was just cruelty in a friendly costume. Still, they relied on each other. When Clara spiraled into self-pity after another failed endeavor, Evelyn would roll her eyes but listen. When Evelyn wallowed in the grayness of her 9-to-5 existence, Clara performed dramatic pep talks that somehow managed to be both inspiring and irritating. It was functional codependency, disguised as closeness. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks had already begun forming. Hairline fractures invisible until pressure would make them split. Clara resented Evelyn's quiet condescension, the way she never openly praised but always seemed to know better. Evelyn, in turn, resented Clara's endless need for validation, the exhausting theatrics, the constant hunger to be the center of every conversation. Neither admitted these truths, not even to themselves. They clung to their alliance because letting go meant acknowledging just how much of their lives had been built on it, and so, year after year, they performed their roles. Clara, the chaotic optimist who never quite succeeded at anything. Evelyn, the cynical realist who never dared to try. They laughed at others, confided in each other, and built their identity around being inseparable. Their reputations even merged. In the eyes of others, when someone invited Clara, they assumed Evelyn would come too. When Evelyn declined a gathering, people expected Clara wouldn't show either. They were less individuals than a brand, two-for-one packaging of sarcasm and judgment. Of course, the universe has a peculiar way of prying apart what people insist cannot be separated. Sometimes it uses time, sometimes distance, sometimes romance. In their case, it would be something smaller, pettier, but far more devastating. An intrusion of jealousy dressed up as opportunity. But for now, in this quiet stretch of their lives, Clara and Evelyn believed themselves untouchable, secure, eternal. They wore their friendship like armor, convinced it made them invincible. They couldn't see that the armor itself was rusting from the inside, ready to crumble at the slightest strike. Trouble rarely arrives with a thunderclap. More often it tiptoes in, barefoot, rearranging the furniture while you're still asleep. For Clara and Evelyn, The rearrangement began with something laughably ordinary, a new colleague in Evelyn's office. His name was Marcus, though his name is ultimately irrelevant because Marcus was not the cause of anything. He was simply the stage prop, the convenient spark tossed onto already dry wood. Evelyn, who normally dismissed co-workers as background noise, spoke of him with unusual frequency. Not glowingly, of course. Evelyn didn't gush, but she dropped his name in casual complaints about meetings, in sarcastic anecdotes about office politics, in offhand remarks that added up to one unmistakable pattern. Marcus had her attention. Clara, ever alert to subtext, noticed immediately. And though she pretended to roll her eyes at the dullness of Evelyn's stories, an acidic irritation began brewing inside her. It wasn't that Clara wanted Marcus. The idea was laughable. No, what Clara wanted was undivided ownership of Evelyn's attention, and Marcus represented theft. To watch Evelyn, who had always reserved her sharpest wit and longest rants for Clara alone, now distribute pieces of herself elsewhere. It was intolerable. Clara told herself she didn't care, but her sarcasm sharpened, her tone grew brittle, and her laughter at Evelyn's Marcus stories was clipped, forced. Evelyn, predictably, noticed. Here the hairline fractures widened. Evelyn, never one to endure sulking in silence, began pulling back. If Clara was going to bristle every time she mentioned Marcus, then Evelyn would simply mention him more. It wasn't a strategy so much as instinct, an unconscious retaliation. And Clara, in turn, retaliated by making subtle jabs about Evelyn's boring office romance. Though it wasn't a romance at all. The jabs landed, of course. Evelyn, who prided herself on being immune to Clara's dramatics, felt the sting, more than she would admit. Soon, their conversation shifted. What had once been an easy rhythm of shared mockery became a minefield. Clara's sarcasm turned meaner. Evelyn's silences grew heavier. Secrets, once poured out freely, were now rationed. Clara, who used to update Evelyn on every impulsive scheme, began withholding details, choosing instead to test how long it would take for Evelyn to ask. Evelyn didn't ask. She was too busy weaponizing her indifference, convinced that Clara's neediness had finally become unbearable. And then came the first real blow. At a mutual acquaintance's birthday gathering, one of those tedious events they usually endured together, mocking everyone else from the corner, Evelyn arrived alone. Clara, who had been late as usual, entered to discover her anchor not waiting for her, but laughing, genuinely laughing, with Marcus. It was nothing more than an office anecdote, a harmless moment. But to Clara, it was treason dressed up as small talk. Her reaction was immediate, though cloaked in performance. She spent the night flitting from conversation to conversation, overcompensating, with exaggerated charm, ignoring Evelyn so thoroughly it became a spectacle. Evelyn, of course, noticed. She always noticed. And while Evelyn would later tell herself she didn't care, she carried the bitterness home with her like a splinter she couldn't dig out. From that evening on, the unspoken rules of their alliance were broken. The assumption of loyalty, their greatest weapon, was gone. Every interaction became a contest. Clara posted performative photos with other acquaintances, carefully staged to imply that she wasn't dependent on Evelyn's company. Evelyn, who despised such displays, retaliated not with photos but with silence, long gaps in response times, deliberately vague answers, the cruel art of making Clara feel unnecessary. What had once bound them together, sarcasm, mockery, superiority, turned inward. Now the targets of ridicule were not outsiders, but each other. Clara scoffed at Evelyn's dreary predictability. Evelyn mocked Clara's constant flailing for attention. Neither remark was said aloud, but both were delivered with enough venom in their silences and gestures that no words were required. The friendship that once defined them now became a battlefield disguised as banter. Their shared kingdom was collapsing. And instead of defending it, they each scrambled to claim the crown. What neither admitted, of course, was how terrifying it felt. Because beneath all the bitterness and pettiness lay the one truth neither could laugh off. Without each other, they were ordinary. And ordinariness was the one fate they had sworn to mock forever. The irony, of course, was delicious. For years, they had built their identities on being smarter, wittier, closer than everyone else. Now, their downfall was indistinguishable from the very dramas they had once ridiculed in others. The betrayal wasn't in the details, Marcus, parties, withheld stories. The betrayal was in the exposure, that their friendship wasn't exceptional at all. It was just as fragile, just as petty, just as disposable as everyone else's. And that realization, though still unspoken, was waiting in the wings, ready to make its grand entrance. The breaking point arrived, as these things often do, in the form of something trivial. It wasn't betrayal carved into stone or scandal shouted across rooftops. No, it was a birthday dinner. Evelyn's, to be precise. A small gathering, carefully curated, the sort of event where every guest list decision is a statement. Clara assumed, of course, that she would be the centerpiece, the co-host in spirit if not in name. After all, wasn't she the self-declared anchor of Evelyn's life? The idea that her role could be anything less was unthinkable, except when the invitation went out, it arrived late. Not absent, but delayed. Everyone else had known for weeks. Clara received her notice days before. Evelyn excused it with a bland explanation about being busy, but Clara recognized the cruelty of precision. Late invitations are never accidents. They are carefully sharpened blades, designed to sting without leaving a visible wound. Still, Clara attended. Oh, she attended. She arrived in a dress one shade too bold, with a laugh one pitch too high, radiating the kind of performative joy that's less about celebration and more about domination. She was determined to reclaim her throne, to remind Evelyn and everyone else that she was not replaceable. But Evelyn had orchestrated the evening with brutal efficiency. Clara found herself seated not beside her best friend, but 3 chairs down, exiled to the margins while Marcus, of all people, occupied the seat of honor. The message was clear. There was no throne to reclaim. Evelyn had dismantled it. The dinner unfolded as a theater of small humiliations. Every anecdote Clara attempted to share was politely dismissed or overshadowed by Evelyn's stories, all of which conveniently included Marcus. Every attempt at sarcastic wit fell flat, as though the room had collectively agreed to stop indulging her. Clara smiled through it all. Of course, her specialty was smiling through defeat. But behind her grin simmered a fury so sharp it felt almost electric. And then came the moment that transformed quiet tension into catastrophe. A toast. Evelyn, ever understated, lifted her glass and began a speech about gratitude for the people who make life brighter. She thanked colleagues, neighbors, even an old friend she barely kept in touch with. Clara's name was absent, not forgotten. Evelyn was too precise for forgetfulness, but omitted. Deliberately, publicly, devastatingly omitted. The silence that followed was brief but deafening. Clara's laugh came seconds too late, a brittle, hollow sound that convinced no one, least of all herself. She raised her glass anyway, masking the humiliation as best she could. But the truth was unmissable. The bond that once defined her had been stripped of its title. She was no longer Evelyn's anchor. She was no longer essential. She was simply extra. After that night, the friendship could not recover. Clara, in her fury, unleashed the only weapon she had left: exposure. She began retelling Evelyn's secrets, carefully selected, strategically exaggerated, to mutual acquaintances. Not outright lies, but distortions, sharpened to make Evelyn appear cold, disloyal, hypocritical. Clara convinced herself it was justice, not vengeance. But vengeance always cloaks itself in noble excuses. Evelyn, discovering the leaks, retaliated in her own way. Silence. The cold, impenetrable wall of indifference. She stopped answering messages, stopped appearing at shared events, stopped acknowledging Clara's existence. And perhaps the cruelty of silence is worse than words, because at least words imply engagement. Silence implies irrelevance. The two who had once mocked the world together now mocked each other privately, through different mediums. Clara with her venomous retellings, Evelyn with her icy absence. Their kingdom was gone, dismantled piece by piece, until nothing remained but rubble and the faint echoes of laughter that once made them believe they were untouchable. The climax wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was in the omission of a name during a toast, in the rearrangement of chairs at a dinner table, in the subtle art of erasure. Betrayal, after all, is not always about what is done. Sometimes it is about what is not said, not acknowledged, not included. And for Clara, that absence was louder than any declaration. Thus ended the illusion of loyalty. What had begun as an alliance of superiority collapsed into the very mediocrity they once scorned. Their friendship, once armor, had become the blade, and the wounds, though invisible, cut deepest of all. After the birthday debacle, nothing was the same. Not that either of them would admit the shift openly. No, they were far too skilled in the art of pretense. Instead, the change manifested in silence, in absences, in the empty spaces where once there had been relentless chatter. The daily texts dwindled to occasional, perfunctory check-ins, each one colder than the last. The calls stopped altogether. Their once constant presence in each other's lives evaporated, leaving behind an echo chamber of memories that now tasted sour. Clara, for all her dramatic flair, did not storm the gates or beg for reconciliation. She performed resilience instead. She made herself conspicuously busy, posting curated updates about her new projects, her exciting connections, her glamorous outings. It was less about joy and more about broadcasting survival. Every photo, every caption was a declaration aimed at Evelyn. See, I don't need you. See, I'm fine. See, I can live without you. And yet, late at night, scrolling through Evelyn's silent profile, Clara felt the hollowness of her own theater. Fine people rarely need to shout that they're fine. Evelyn, in contrast, wore her detachment like armor. She didn't retaliate with flashy displays or defensive speeches. Instead, she erased Clara with surgical precision. At gatherings, when Clara's name surfaced, Evelyn's face remained neutral, her responses clipped, her tone flat. She neither condemned nor praised. She simply withdrew. And in doing so, she inflicted a cruelty Clara could never match. She made her irrelevant. Because irrelevance is the one insult that leaves no room for rebuttal, their mutual acquaintances noticed, of course. How could they not? Where once there had been a duo so inseparable that their names were practically hyphenated, now there were two solo acts, each pretending the other didn't exist. People whispered, speculated, traded theories. Clara seized on the attention, dropping hints and half-truths about Evelyn's coldness. Evelyn refused to dignify it with a word. And soon, the whispers quieted, because gossip thrives on reaction, and Evelyn gave none. For both, the absence was sharper than they expected. Clara missed the certainty of having someone who understood her before she even spoke. Evelyn missed the convenience of having someone who mirrored her cynicism, without judgment. But pride is a stubborn parasite, feeding on what might have been and choking what still could be. Neither would risk admitting they cared, because caring was synonymous with losing, and so they settled into the uneasy rhythm of estrangement. Not enemies, too tired for that. Not friends, too broken for that. Something in between, a limbo, where memories are both treasured and tainted, where the ghost of what was haunts every corner of what remains if there was regret. It lived in quiet moments. In the way Clara paused before sending a photo, tempted to share it with Evelyn before remembering she no longer could. In the way Evelyn scrolled past an article Clara would have loved, her fingers twitching with the reflex to send it before pulling back, tiny fractures of longing, quickly smothered by pride. Because nothing is more unbearable than admitting that the person you built your identity with has now become a stranger. And so, their story drifted into reflection rather than resolution, a slow unraveling, not with fire but with ash. In the end, there was no dramatic reconciliation, no heartfelt apology, no cinematic reunion over coffee. Their friendship didn't collapse in flames. It simply dissolved, like sugar stirred into water until it vanished, leaving only a faint sweetness behind. They carried on with their lives, outwardly unscathed, inwardly altered. Clara leaned further into her theatrics, amplifying the performance of independence until even she almost believed it. She surrounded herself with acquaintances who mistook her sarcasm for wit, who laughed a little too eagerly at her jokes. But none of them ever matched Evelyn's precision, that uncanny ability to understand her rhythms without explanation. Clara's stage was full, yet she felt perpetually underwhelmed by her audience. Evelyn, for her part, sank deeper into her own stillness. She convinced herself she preferred it this way, quieter, cleaner, uncomplicated by Clara's dramatics. She built a life of steady routines and mild acquaintances, none of whom challenged her, none of whom demanded her loyalty. It was peaceful, yes, but also a little empty. A garden with no weeds, but no wildflowers either. The tragedy of their story was not in the betrayal itself, but in what it revealed. For all their mocking of others, Clara and Evelyn had been ordinary all along. Two people clinging to each other out of fear of irrelevance, mistaking sarcasm for intimacy, mistaking exclusivity for loyalty. They thought themselves exceptional. But when the bond snapped, they unraveled like anyone else. There is, of course, a bitter irony in this. Their entire friendship had been built on superiority, on the conviction that they were smarter, sharper, closer than everyone else. And yet, their ending was indistinguishable from every other ending. A slow cooling of affection, a series of petty contests, a silence that grew until it became permanent. They weren't above the pettiness of human nature. They were its perfect exhibit. What remained was memory. Memory of 1,000 shared jokes, of whispered confessions in dim rooms, of laughter so intense it hurt, and memory of the small, almost imperceptible moments when those things began to rot. Neither of them would ever forget, though both would pretend to. Because forgetting would mean the years they spent together were meaningless, and neither could bear that possibility. As so, they carried the ghost of each other forward. Clara, with her restless hunger for validation, forever haunted by the one person who saw through her and still stayed, until she didn't. Evelyn, with her cynical calm, forever shadowed by the one person who made her laugh loudly, until she couldn't. The story ends not with a bang, but with a question. What is worse, losing a friend, or realizing the friendship was never as indestructible as you believed? Perhaps betrayal is not the knife in the back, but the slow, humiliating discovery that you were never invincible together, just fragile in tandem. And maybe that is the ultimate truth about friendship. It is not eternal, not sacred, not unbreakable. It is temporary, conditional, and terrifyingly human. And yet, despite all that, we seek it out again and again, because even a fragile bond is better than no bond at all. That is the comedy and the cruelty of it. The end.